Hello, I'm Karen Harvey of Reinvintaged. I'm a vintage dressmaker and I've had my business for 7 years now. My business of doing vintage recreations came from my love of the vintage aesthetic, specifically concentrating on the 1920s to the 1960s. I come with 35 years of dressmaking experience behind me and am third generation sewer in my family now, having picked up my skills at a young age from both my mum and my grandmother. Over this short video I'll be going through a few things with you. These sewing cabinets, which contain a lot of my materials, where my pattern collection comes from, a little bit of the history of the wartime fashions development and the outbreak of war from 1939 to 1945, along with other things in my collection, including dresses and costume recreations from the wartime era. Just before I take you through to my sewing area, I'll go through the outfit that I'm wearing at the moment. This is from a 1941 pattern, reproduced in PDF format and easily and readily downloadable for the modern at-home sewer now. And this is classed as dinner or at-home pyjamas. Basically, it's like an all-in-one jumpsuit with a zip front, zips having just about started to be used in the middle of the 1930s, and is the kind of dress come outfit which is really nice and comfortable for day long at home wear, but also if you were expecting a visitor such as the local vicar or the like. So I'll just give you a round example of this outfit and then I'll take you through to see the sewing area. So as you can see, this is my main sewing area. I do have a sewing den out in the garden, but that can only be used in the summertime. This is my main base of operations. As you can see from the photos behind me, I like to have some lovely 1930s influenced pictures up on the wall and everything to hand whilst I'm working. Over here we have the cotton storage, buttons, buckles, things like that, and in the drawers here we have easy to reach cottons, findings, scissors, interfacing, anything like that. Absolutely invaluable storage drawers here. Now, the way that I sew does tend to mean that I have a number of things on the go at once, all depending on the type of colour that I have at the point in time. And one of my current projects is this lovely 1930s sports set. So I'm particularly concentrating on the shorts and blouse here, and this blouse in this fabric is what I'm currently working on. I also have a number of other projects on the go at the same time that are the same colours, the red and the blue. Both of those are original vintage fabrics. One is going to be a pack move and the other is going to be a vintage play suit. The other things that are on my table to work on at the moment are customer orders and things like that. Hello. So, first of all to show is the array of the fabric cabinets that I have here in the conservatory. I chose to store all my fabrics like this because my customers and friends like to have an easy to view way of looking at the fabrics, and also it's very useful for me to be able to have easy view of them also when looking to use fabrics for particular projects and things like that. I did tend to get to the stage where I was doing them in era order, so if somebody said that they wanted something 30s or 40s print, then I could go specifically to a certain place, and there is still some order to it, but it's very much how much weight that the shelves, glass shelves can take, and also where I can fit it at the moment, because these aren't the only storage solutions for the fabrics. So I'll be going on in a short while to the German pattern magazines and my extensive pattern collection, but just to give you an example, this first off is a late 1930s German pattern magazine blouse pattern. Now these are featured in these magazines here, the vintage German pattern magazines, so if we have a close-up of that one there. And these were very much like the precursor to the Berda magazines that came out in the 1950s, and they have images of glorious fashions in them, such as we have here. I'll give you a closer look at these later. And then a most confusing huge fabric pattern magazine there to trace off your pattern pieces and make up your items such as this. So we'll be having a closer look at those later. First of all though, let's have a look into the fabric cabinets, which are a bit like an Aladdin's cave / chocolate box of exciting things. First up, before I just go into the cabinets, this is one of my 3, possibly 4 vintage sewing machines. This actually has a serial number on. All Singer sewing machines have serial numbers on, and this serial number helps date this particular one, albeit not in its original casing, to the early 1900s. So this is one of my earliest Singer sewing machines. Wonderful working order hand crank that has been beautifully serviced by the husband and is in full working order and has been used by Junior to sew stuff with. So absolutely lovely, beautiful example of a vintage Singer sewing machine there. So if we have a look now into the cabinets themselves I've tended to get from auctions or car boot sales, things like that. They can be picked up for a song nowadays. So in here we have a number of very fancy fabrics on the top: chiffons, taffetas, sari fabrics, and tools, the kind of things that you'd probably be using for evening wear. We have a spotty flocked tulle there. We also have a wonderfully flock patterned tulle there, very much suitable for a 1950s style evening dress with a lovely border pattern to it. And then we go on in this particular cabinet to a variety of fabrics. We've got some wools, we've got some crepes, and we've got some heavier fabrics on the bottom there, some upholstery fabrics and things like that. Moving on to the next cabinet, we have a lovely mix in here of some fab evening fabrics and also some lovely satins. So if I bring this one closer to the camera, this one is a lovely cobalt blue stretch satin charmeuse. I love the stretch satin charmeuse for the evening dresses because they're stretchy and they lend themselves perfectly to the 1930s evening dress drape. So there's a pile of satins there, all colour-coded for easy reference. Then we have some fake furs over here and some original furs for trims and things like that. And then we have a selection of satins moving on down into here, and some more lovely evening fabrics down here. For example, that lovely sequiny red shimmer. And then also onto the end cabinet here, This is where a lot of it is date orientated, where we've got a lot of 30s, 40s prints, stripes, florals. Now to have a look at some of the patterns in my collection. Now my paper patterns scan from the 1920s all the way through to the 1960s, and I would say that this is one of my oldest 1920s patterns. So this is a mail order, Daily Mail pattern, which would have been advertised in a newspaper of the time, and you sent off for it with a voucher to get the pattern pieces, and here they are here now. Now the earlier patterns, when they started being issued for home sewers, did tend to have very limited instructions. But these are very good and detailed and in very good condition for their age as well. So these are examples of the instructions that were given with this particular 1920s pattern. I'm sure you'll agree, excellent quality. It's almost like it hasn't been used. This is what we call a factory folds pattern, whereby it's still in its original folds like the day it was made. So that's one of my oldest patterns there, a 1920s one. Also dating from the 1920s, I like to collect the Weldon's magazines, or New Women magazines. These were fashion magazines that were aimed at the ladies, and they tended to sell a number of patterns from a specific manufacturer. In this case, the manufacturer was Bestway. I'll have a Weldon's one to show you later. And they would have pictures in of the type of patterns that you could buy, and then also brown tissue pieces for a pattern that is featured within the pages. This particular one, a lovely nightie and negligee set. This one, as opposed to the first one, is really showing its age. You can see the brown tissue paper is actually starting to get very tiny little holes in it. So that is actually in deterioration already. So you have to be very careful handling something like that. They tend to be stored in acid-free bags so that they don't deteriorate any further. That also is a nightdress pattern that would accompany that kind of magazine. Side of the packets that seeks to explain why the pattern pieces aren't perforated anymore, and I either researched it or suspect it, I can't remember which it is, but what it most likely happened is that the machines that would have punched the pattern pieces were damaged during the Blitz and some other factory bombing by the Germans, and therefore they actually had to start printing onto the pattern pieces. So you'd have had a stamp that said front bodice, or some other type of non-mechanical version, actually manual version, of being able to identify what the pattern pieces were, whether they were by name or whether they were by number. But that perforations that identified tissue patterns like this did disappear for a time during the war, and as I say, I either read it or I made the assumption that it is because the machinery was damaged during the ongoing onslaught of the war. So talking about how the war affected both sides, both the Allies and the Axis, the Germans were of course on the opposite side in the war, and these vintage German pattern magazines were very common for many at-home dressmakers from the beginning of about the 1900s. And the German pattern magazines were still being printed well into the 40s, despite the fact that the Germans themselves would have been under fire, but still wanted to sort of like do the bit for the German Hausfrau, as they would be called, and continued to print these gorgeous fashion magazines, as they would be. So this one in particular is dated 1940, and we have a winter edition here, as can be seen by the knitting patterns on the back. And they were very much sort of like a general interest thing. Some of these you will actually see Nazi propaganda on the inside pages, which is how you can see that actually the ruling party did actually want to keep the German Hausfrau at home and sewing for success, so to speak. So we have general news pages there, all in German, of course. This is where my GCSE German gets brushed up, and then we move on to the fashion pages. So these are where the real joy lies. And what they do is they give each pattern a number, and they give you a bust size, and from the bust size you can work out the remainder of the measurements. And there truly are some absolutely fantastic insights into not only the fashions of the time, but the fashions that were encouraged in Germany. But of course, just as the Nazis used some of the Parisian fashion houses to dress both the military and the wives of military, they also had very much an influence into the on-the-street fashions of the time, and you can very much see the military influence, the boxiness, the length of the skirts, pleats and utilitarian hints coming through into the fashion magazines of the time as well. And there we have some accessories patterns there as well. So, and when I was saying earlier about the how to use up pieces that you've already got, there is a classic example. The Germans were encouraged to do exactly the same as we were over here in England, and that is how to reuse somebody's suit to make pattern pieces for your children in particular. And it was very common for women of husbands who'd gone away to war to actually reuse their civvy suits to make a suit for themselves. Now, to give you a closer example of how the vintage German pattern magazines work, this is what you have to contend with when you're looking to trace off your patterns. So you've got what looks like a confused road map of lines, and they all have different markings for different lines. You have a key down here which identifies what particular line markings you're looking for the pattern that you want to follow, and once you get used to them they are relatively easy, although they can be very tiring on the brain, and I find that a couple of vodkas help move things along rather smoothly. On to the fashions of the 1930s, late 1930s and early 1940s on the outbreak of war, World War II in the UK and the rest of the world. Now, everybody had their own rationing and other hard to get hold of commodities, and in the UK the clothing rationing didn't come on immediately in the outbreak of war in 1939. So this blouse here and the blouse that I'm wearing would have been the style of blouses that were apparent at the time. Both blouses have a yoke effect here with some nice top stitching detail, which was a technique still seen very common in the late 1930s, and very much had almost a unisex look to it in the construction. nice big collared lapels such as these here, and also in a very utilitarian crispy type of cotton and fabric which had both durability and wearability. This dress is to a 1940s Vogue reissue pattern, meaning that it was originally a pattern that was issued in the 1940s that Vogue has recently reprinted for use by the modern dressmaker. Now, shortly after the outbreak of the war in 1939, rationing had not quite yet been instigated. There was a leaning towards the more utilitarian look that was being influenced by the abundance of military uniforms that were in the news and on the high street. So as the war went on, there was a move away from these more sort of like feminine styles. Very much the sleeve fullness that we have here and the pleat details that we have here are very much more synonymous with the end of the 1930s. Lovely big blousey sleeves here that didn't really make a comeback until the 1950s after the war had finished. And obviously the length of the skirt also is still a good 3 to 4 inches below the knee. As war went on, the hemline came up in order to preserve the amounts of fabric that we used. So the fabric used here also has very much a 1940s influence to it. In June 1941, the United Kingdom introduced clothes rationing in order to help in the war effort. Obviously, with the outbreak of war, manufacturing had to be concentrated on those areas that helped the Allies win the war, such as munitions and the like. And obviously there was trouble getting raw materials such as the cotton from America in order to manufacture clothing. So the government brought in rationing in 1941 and also a utility clothing label in 1942, which was called the CC41 label. This did away with unnecessary trims, buttons, gave stipulations on skirt lengths and the like, and also on both women's and men's clothing, and also complied with the rationing requirements that the average family were given in relation to their annual allowances. So this particular blouse here is from a 1942 pattern, when we're seeing the influence of peplum detailing on both blouses and dresses. We have very much a much more simpler silhouette than the previous dress that you saw, and it has an access side zip and a tie fastening here. It also has a neck opening fastening to the back. Now, this obviously would use, I would say, approximately 1 to 1.5 yards of fabric, so well within your abilities to be able to make this from the rationing requirements. But some items, of course, weren't rationed, and some of these included hats. And I have here an original 1940s tilt trilby, which goes very well with this outfit. And you could trim hats, you could restyle hats. If your husband had a trilby and he'd gone away to war, you were encouraged, in fact, by the government in some of the Pathé films that you can find online, on how to refashion your husband's trilby into a very nice tilt hat with feminine trims to it, all part of the make, do and mend effort during the war. Ration coupon allocations decreased as the war went on, and therefore by the end of the war you were finding that you had only about 23 ration coupons for the year in order to clothe yourself, and therefore you were getting very much more inventive with reusing old materials, old clothing, or mending stuff that had become worn out. Here we have another example of the simplicities of the blouses in the 1940s, probably around 43, 44, compared to the yoked versions that I showed you earlier. We have here a much more simple version here, a shaped collar that is shaped into the front panel, meaning that there's less fabric to be used, grouping of buttons for a nice decorative effect because buttons weren't rationed as much, and then shaping of the darts at the bottom. Also, to accessorise with this, we have a very fetching hat, which is actually from a reproduction label that I like to buy from, and this hat is a classic example of what the housewives would be doing in the era, which is reshaping an old hat with a crease inside such as this, and making nice decorations on it with a new piece of braiding or ribbon and a feather such as this. As the war went on and as the Americans joined the war, it made a slight difference to what was available in the UK, especially when the GIs got stationed over here and could not only bring in nylon stockings, which were very hard to get hold of and very expensive in the UK, but also brought over some of the influences of their fashions back in the US. This particular dress is a classic example of this, featuring a lovely floral Hawaiian print. Now, this particular dress fabric and pattern, the dress fabric being original, was very much out of reach for the average housewife in the rationing constraints that we had in the UK, but may well have been sported by the military wives or those more well off in the US. We have a lovely drape detail here on the front and folds, something that of course wouldn't have been permitted in the fashions in the UK at the time, and also a drape here. But other than that, looking at the classic silhouette of the 1940s with a good statement shoulder here, some nice cape sleeves, and the side fastening and back neck fastening also. And to accessorise an outfit such as this, we have a lovely reproduction hat to a late 1930s, early 1940s style. Now, on cessation of the war in September 1945, then that obviously gave much celebrations, as we all know, in the UK and Europe with VE Day on the 8th of May 1945, but also it very slowly started opening up manufacturing and the availability of clothing, although rationing did in fact go on until the early 1950s. Even the Queen, when she got married in late 1947, was sent many numbers of coupons for the fabric for her wedding dress that the average housewife had donated, because it was still very hard to get that amount of fabric, but of course she was to be the Queen, and when she got married nobody wanted her to have to scrimp on a gorgeous wedding dress. Also at the same time in 1947, the very restrictive CC41 utility range that had been brought in during the war swapped over to what we call the double plate, or it's got two lines, a circle and two lines on the other side, and that was again slightly less restrictions than in the wartime, which, as I say, carried on until the 1950s, but brought about, especially for the home dressmaker, from about 46 onwards, a very distinct change in style. It was still before the Dior New Look of 1947, which brought in the voluminous skirts that caused a bit of a stir because there were, as many saw, unnecessary use of fabric, but very much sort of like brought about this 1946 issue pattern that was more feminine, less utilitarian. The skirt length was dropping again, and basically started letting the average housewife feel more feminine and less constrained. The final 1940s look is the dress that I show here, which again probably owes a lot of its influence to the US, and I believe the pattern was dated 1947. So obviously this is just before the Dior new look came out from Paris, and we've got some lovely draping across here with some gathers into the waist, a lovely gathering here which gives a nice feminine effect to it, and some lovely sleeve detail where we're beginning to see the fullness of the sleeves that were evident in the late 1930s coming back in again with pleats and folds as the restrictions on rationing started to be lifting. And this particular fabric was actually an original 1940s starburst design that has been reprinted onto modern fabric by a dedicated aficionado, and she has a lot of reproduction fabrics which are great to use for dressmaking because it enables us to make something that is very much of the era, but obviously unlike the earlier blue dress that I showed you where it is original fabric and it is more likely to fade, this one can actually sustain the washing of the modern machines, and therefore you get a really wearable wash and wear dress for modern day reenacting. And yet again, that lovely reproduction hat from the Heritage Milliner, I'll give details of those at the end of the video, goes very well with picking out the red in the dress, as was very evident of the era. If you had some standard coloured accessories that could go with multiple outfits, then it made your outfits look very different each time.